Hey everybody, John the Other here. Obviously. And I want to begin with a question. Now, this is really only a question for the male viewers and listeners, of whom are like 95 to 97% of the people listening or watching this video are male. 3 to 7% are 3 to 5% are female, and I'm not even sure what they're doing here, but anyway, this question is only for the men. And I don't expect you to answer in the comments, just in your head. How many of you, by percentage, have been sexually assaulted that you can remember in your lifetime? I'm going to guess that, whether you comment or not, the number is somewhere between 0, it'll be more than 0, and somewhere lower than 100%. So some number greater than 1%, greater than 0% and less than 100%. Somewhere in there. That's a pretty broad range, right? That's like pretty much the maximum allowable range by theory. But I'm going to ask the question another way. How many of you guys only, have in your lifetime that you can remember had somebody, a stranger, walk up to you and grab your butt, grab you by the balls, grab your crotch, or in some other way sexually grab you or physically touch you in some way? Now, asked that way, without using the words sexual assault, I would guess that the number would be between 50 and 95%, probably edging closer to 95%. It might even be 100%. And there's a significant observation in the fact that the way you ask that question changes the number. If you say sexual assault, the number's going to be very low. But if you just say how many people have grabbed you by the ass, how many people strangers have grabbed you by the ass when you weren't expecting it, you're going to get a very much higher number. And I would guess that most guys have had that happen. It certainly happened to me, I don't know, more than a dozen times in my life, so many that I couldn't count. And in none of those cases did I turn around and immediately physically, violently assault the person who did it. In some cases I turned around and said, hey, F off. In other cases I was like, what the hell, dude? Or it was a woman, I said, no, don't touch. But in 0% of those cases that it happened to me, did I turn around and violently assault the person. And I say that for a reason. Because I'm talking about a CBC radio article dealing with a CBC radio interview of a woman whose first story in her interview on CBC radio is telling about being dancing in a club, having somebody grab her by the butt, turn around and violently assault the person who may or may not have been the right person. She tells the story proudly. The article is, I want patriarchy to fear women. Mona Elthaway says the time for being civil, peaceful, and polite is over. Feminist author and activist shares her call to action for women and girls. Oh good, another feminist call for action for women and girls. Mona Elthaway urges that radical steps need to be taken in order to dismantle patriarchy, including the use of, quote, justifiable violence against men. The Egyptian-American journalist and activist argues that being civil, respectful, and polite should no longer be options for women and girls. Now, I'm going to focus in on the word civil here, because civil is the root word of the word civilization. Politeness upholds the power of patriarchy, she told Out in the Open host Paya Chattopadhyay. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. It's the host of the CBC show she got interviewed on. I want patriarchy to fear feminism. I want patriarchy to fear women. Now later, she points out that when she says patriarchy, she doesn't mean men. And I will say she's right. Because what she means by patriarchy is civilization. I want civilization to fear feminism. I want civilization to fear women. Well, of course it should, because the goal here is to tear civilization down. To, and I put quotes around this because this is what she says, burn it to the ground. Elthaway is recognized for spearheading the Mosque Me Too movement in 2018, where Muslim women spoke out about being sexually assaulted in sacred spaces, including while on the Hajj, an Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, Saudi Arabia. She also coined the hashtag I beat my assaulter after a man in a Montreal nightclub groped her, and she proceeded to beat him up, or beat somebody up who she thought was him. Now, I'm going to play the clip of the story where she tells this story. It's the first thing she says in her interview.
Here I am now, in February of 2018. I am 50 years old, in a club in Montreal, Canada. I'm dancing, trying to forget sexual assault, and I feel a hand on my ass, and I think you've got to be kidding me. How is this still happening? Reaction now that I'm 50 years old is I turn around and I'm like, no way. I found him and I went up to him. I tugged really hard at his shirt and he tripped over the stage. And I punched and I punched and I punched. And every time I punched him, I said, don't you ever touch a woman like that again. Don't you ever touch a woman like that again. And every time I thought I was done punching him, I punched some more.
Just to be clear, you're really beating him up. It is violent.
Oh, yeah. I'm beating him up. It is violent. It was the most clarity I had felt in a really long time, Pia. Because I needed to defend myself against this man's sexual assault. Because I had spent the previous 5 days inundated with stories of sexual assault. So here I was, taking it out on this man who had just sexually assaulted me. And then he finally stood up, watching him, and he wanted to see who this woman was, who had beat him up. And he looked me in the eye, and I wasn't done, and I smacked him straight across his jaw. I almost broke my finger. And he understood that I wasn't done with him, so he ran away.
Now, I'm going to point out that in the story, the guy ran away, according to her, because he understood she wasn't finished with him. But really, he ran away because he understood that she was, due to her sexual demographic, due to her identity group, privileged to be allowed to continuously assault him in public, and he was not permitted socially to defend himself against that assault. So his own alternative was to remove himself. Because if it had been a man assaulting him, he could have been easily allowed to throw a punch and defend himself. So this whole story cannot even exist in its present form without her being a person of supreme social power to enact public violence against him. And if he had raised a hand in defense of himself, the mob would have stepped in and beaten him down. I mean, this is obvious. A couple of things are clear from this. Number one is, the guy she beat up may or may not have been the guy who actually grabbed her butt. Number two is, nobody stepped in. Her enacting a violent assault in a club in front of a bunch of people, no bystander stepped in, no security stepped in, she didn't get thrown out, she didn't get ejected, she didn't get banned, she didn't get arrested. The guy she assaulted also, although it was clear from the description that she wasn't really doing him the injury that a man assaulting him would do, he protected her from the results of her assault, which would be, if a man had done that to him, an immediate rebuttal, an immediate beatdown. So she wants to engage in public violence, rage, all this stuff. We'll get to that. But she also wants to continue living in a world where everybody protects her because she's in a protected class. And I don't think those two things are compatible. Anyway, in her latest book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, Althaway says women and girls need to harness, here we go, anger, attention-seeking, ambition, power, profanity, lust, and violence in order to be truly liberated from what she describes as the tentacles of the octopus known as patriarchy. In other words, to be liberated from civilization, to depart from civilization. And she's on the right path. Althaway sat down with Paya, the host of the CBC show, to have a deeply personal conversation about being sexually assaulted, how her lived experiences have helped her arrive at an unequivocal strength of conviction within herself, and her views on feminism. Now, this is the new state-funded feminism. I'm going to talk briefly about what the CBC is to give you a sense of the weight of this article. The CBC is a government-owned, taxpayer-funded corporate broadcasting corporation that competes with the regular media. It competes with regular for-pay news, which I think is a little bit grotesque. Now, I'm not completely against having our taxes pay for community radio or pay for community access programming, but it should be at the scale of a community radio station, like a college radio station or a local co-op radio. But the CBC is a little bit bigger than that. You go to their Wikipedia page and it says their annual revenue is $531 million for 2017. Their revenue for the year, though, is $1.7 billion when you include government funding. So somewhere over $1 billion per year is being paid to the CBC while they are competing with regular radio and television broadcasters. That's kind of grotesque, and it tells you that this is actually a state propaganda channel. So what's being pushed with our taxes is a woman who advocates for women to depart civilization and embrace what she calls her 7 deadly sins. her 7 necessary sins for women and girls, which are, I'll find them again, anger, attention-seeking, ambition, power, profanity, lust, and violence. So it's basically the 7 biblical deadly sins. To tear down civilization, which she calls patriarchy. She wants to be rude and violent and psychopathic and narcissistic, and she's acting like she's a member of an oppressed class, and yet here we have her telling a story on the radio of engaging in a direct, vicious, and violent assault against a stranger in a public place in front of people with security. Nobody stepped in. I think she's got a bit of power and privilege already, more than a normal citizen. So she describes the sin of ambition. What does practicing the sin of ambition look like in your life? And she says, I deserve more, I am worthy of more. I mean, okay, that's greed, right? Like, that's the classic sin of greed. Now, I don't want to get all biblical on you here, but this is what she's actually advocating. And I'm going to suggest that if your goal is to tear down civilization with your new virtues being rage, narcissism, sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but this is what she says. Rage, which she says is anger, attention-seeking, that's narcissism, ambition, that's greed, power, profanity, lust, and violence. Well, what are you going to build with those being your guiding principles? You're going to build a dystopia, a violent, psychopathic, dysfunctional dystopia in which order and social order and the way you get along with other people is simply going to be reduced to whoever has the rock in their hand and can be fastest to smash the other person over the skull. That's going to be the society you want. Well, I would suggest to you that because this is on the billion-dollar funded CBC, the ideology of feminism is now quite clearly and openly, well, violent right at the start. That's obvious. They're not even denying it. They're actually openly calling for violence. They're illustrating it with a story of personal violence to make it very clear that this is not just theoretical, oh, we're just talking in metaphor. No. She wants to violently assault people with the sanction of, the state, with the sanction of the public, while still being a member of a protected class. Because you imagine what would happen to a man who started this violent assault in a club. Now, there's one more thing that I think is... let's close that. There's one more thing that I think is worth mentioning here later in the article on the CBC website, where they ask her, Mona, you essentially reject the idea that the patriarchy, civilization, can be overturned or dismantled, can be burned to the ground. Those are the words in the article. While being civil, peaceful, and polite, you argue that violence is a necessary sin for women and girls. That is highly controversial. What exactly do you mean by that? First, I'm going to say it's not controversial. If it was controversial, it wouldn't be on the taxpayer-funded CBC. This is mainstream. Sorry. First correction. But her answer, I understood that it was highly controversial. No, it's not. It's on the taxpayer-funded CBC. And that was intentional. I asked people to imagine. Now, she kind of equivocates here. She's double or triple underlines the word imagine in her statement. Imagine a scenario in which we kill a certain number of men every week. How many men must we kill until patriarchy sits across the table from us and says, okay, stop. What must we do so that you can stop this culling? Now, this is kind of a spectacular reveal into the mindset of the feminist. She's advocating a thought experiment in which we murder a certain number of men every single week to get their attention, to get them to comply, I guess. Completely neglecting the fact that most violent crime lands on men. Most murder victims are men. Most people who die in the workplace are men, 97%. Most military deaths are men. Most people who die on the street are men. Most of the homeless are men. Most 80% of suicides are men. So this hypothetical, imaginary, routine killing of men that she is proposing is now and always has been ongoing. Continuously ongoing. She can't see that, though, because she lives in her little bubble. So she's actually proposing it as if it's a revolutionary thought experiment. She triple underlines that it's imaginary, except that it's not. It's real. It's actually happening now. So that to put men, to bring men to curb, to bring men to heel, to bring patriarchy to its knees and burn it down and put women in absolute and total, supreme, unanimous, 100% control of everything. Well, I mean, we'll have a violent, dysfunctional, dystopian hellscape of a civilization if we do that, which is, I think, where we're going on a very quick, rapidly greased path. And the proposed idea that we should murder a certain number of men every week in order to get everyone's attention, or I don't know, as a negotiating tactic. Well, it's not imaginary. It's what happens in real life already. You know, most murder victims are men. Most homeless people are men. Most people who die on the street are men. Most suicides are men. Most workplace deaths are men, and so on and so on and so on. And so I don't think it's a stretch. I don't think it's a stretch at all to look at this on the CBC, on the billion-dollar funded mainstream, hyper-mainstream, middle-of-the-road CBC, that this violence and murder advocacy mainstream, that this ideology is fundamentally the ideology that is the enemy of humanity, the enemy of everybody, not just men, everybody, because we're going to reduce our civilization to who has the rock in their hand and can smash the other person's head first. That's how social order is going to be divided or settled. Not a world I want to live in. And imagine pushing that and still thinking that you're going to remain a protected class. Anyway, thanks very much for listening, and as always, have a lovely, lovely day.